now. Okay, we're going through Lord Normanby's brief. Lord Normanby was the colonial secretary in London, and he gave a brief to Hobson before he came here. And you notice that it's dated the 14th of August, 1839. And you'll remember that they had an interest in New Zealand for two reasons. One is that it had great natural resources. That's the first thing. And secondly, it had geographical location. So they thought that was good, and they said this is a hot colony. But they said on the other hand that the ministers of the Crown, that's the British, have been restricted by still higher motives for engaging in such an enterprise of colonising New Zealand. They said, okay, well, this country's got lots of good resources. It's well positioned in the South Pacific for a strategic base for us. But you know what? There's other things that are driving us to colonise New Zealand. Well, what were those things? And they said here, they have deferred to the advice of the Committee of the House of Commons in the year 1836 to inquire into the state of the Aborigines residing in the vicinity of our colonial settlements. Well, that's Maori, and have concurred with that committee in thinking that the increase in national wealth and power promised by the acquisition of New Zealand would be most inadequate compensation for the injury which might be inflicted on this kingdom, on New Zealand itself, by embarking on a measure essentially unjust, but too certainly fraught with calamity to a numerous and inoffensive people whose title to the soil and to the sovereignty of New Zealand is undisputable and has been solemnly recognised by the British government. Now, what do you get out of that?
It's totally unfounded.
It's a heck
in
of
the light of history.
It's a heck of a big. It's a heck of a big sentence. That's the longest sentence you'll ever get. It's one sentence. But what they were saying was this. Okay, I'll just get you to tell me what you think. Why is it unjust, Mark?
Well, it's not so much unjust. It's just that fear they had of the damage they were going to do to these people, has, in the light of history, has turned out to be unfounded. Yes. That's not the case at all.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Because you're saying that it's all turned to custard.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Yep. What other comments has anybody got to make about this?
Okay. They're obviously concerned for the welfare of the Maori people. That was a big motivation.
Yes, they're saying really that when they got a report, advice of the Committee of the House of Commons in 1836, they found that when they acquired these colonies, that what happened was the Aboriginal people of the colonies were wiped out.
Mm-hmm.
And he's saying we actually don't want that to happen. And he calls Maori an inoffensive people. Now, you know what, this is hugely important. Why did he mean inoffensive? Because he knew that they were cannibals and they were into slavery. They were killing their babies, infanticide. And they were a absolutely diabolical group of people. So
he mentions that when inoffensive, he means they weren't a threat to them.
Yes, that's what he means. He means they're not an international threat. They're not like the Spaniards or the Portuguese or the French. They are a people who are inoffensive in terms of international relations. They're no sweat. They're no threat to Britain. But they know full well that they're cannibals, because he mentions it later on. So who's title to this is the most important bit. So he says, we don't want to, we don't want to hurt Maori, whose title to the soil and to the sovereignty of New Zealand is indisputable and has been solemnly recognised by the British government. Now, that's a very big sentence. That's a very big call. They're saying the British government recognised Maori as sovereign in New Zealand. In other words, Maori owned New Zealand.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, that's important because, well, you tell me why that's important.
I can't understand how they actually came to they could regard them as sovereign when, one, they had no sovereign and they were warring. So there was no unity. So how can you have a sovereign state? I don't get that.
Okay, very good question. All right, anybody want to comment on that?
I think maybe not so much sovereign. They were respecting the fact that they thought Maori just owned the land, possessed it.
Well, the answer started in 1831 when the 13 Ngāpuhi chiefs wrote to King Edward, and he came back and said, pretty much, we're going to be your protector. We'll look after you. Then Busby got going with Hei Whakaputanga, which is the Declaration of Independence, 1835. And 52 chiefs signed that eventually. And they came up with their own flag. And so I think the British are saying, all things considered, we consider New Zealand to be, we can't go in and just take the land off Maori, because they'd been building a bit of a relationship with them. Now, the missionaries had been here for how long?
Since 1814.
Yes, the missionaries had been here since 1814. And the missionaries had been building. So 1814 to 1840 is 26 years.
Mm.
And so the missionaries had been building relationships with the Maori. And if the British had come in and just said, hey, mate, we'll move over, we're going to take all your land, I mean, how would that help what the missionaries are trying to do? The missionaries are trying to get converts and show that Christianity was a beautiful religion with beautiful people. And how do you think the Maoris would have reacted if they just landed with 10 warships and pushed all the Maori aside and said, now, mate, this is our land?
They would have thought we're hypocrites.
It would have thought we're hypocrites, and it would have absolutely wrecked all the work the missionaries had been doing. So they said, you know what? In Britain, they had a big discussion about this, and they said, we're going to classify New Zealand as a sovereign country. Now, they knew that New Zealand just had a collection of what they call petty tribes who were warring, not capable of forming any sort of a government. They knew all that. But they still thought, you know what, we've got to just let them have the land, and we'll recognise them as a sovereign country. And for that reason, they said the only way we're going to get a government established here is by getting a treaty with them. We can't take it by force. We have to get their permission. So
just showing them respect.
He's shown them a lot of respect. So you know what, the whole narrative of activists today that the British came in here and raped and pillaged and didn't care a crap about Maori is just completely false.
Mm.
In fact, when you read this document as we go through it, it's astounding how much ink they expend on trying to help Maori. And you know what? They're really the British are really being crapped on by Maori today, because the British went out of their way to help Maori, and Maori just throwing it all back in their faces today.
Mm.
It's shameful, actually. We retain these opinions with unimpaired force, in other words, that Maori are sovereign and that we're going to look after Maori and we don't want to hurt them.
Can you share your screen?
Oh, you can't see the screen?
No.
No, not mine.
Oh,
No.
what? What? Oh my goodness, you should have told me earlier. What are you doing?
I'm just listening to you reading.
Oh,
We're just listening to
We're
what
just looking at each other.
We're listening.
Okay,
Yeah, we've been listening well.
So you can see that now?
No.
No.
Oh, heck. What's going on here? Wait a minute. Wait a minute. This is not how it's supposed to go.
Maybe to pause and have a little technical break.
No, it's
That's
okay.
right.
It's all right. This is all very natural.
Yeah.
Okay, so now you can see it.
It's coming.
Yes, it's coming up now.
Okay, so we've got here. There
Here we go.
Okay, so he says we retain these opinions in unimpaired force and through circumstances entirely beyond our control have at length compelled us to alter our course. Now that's interesting. He says, mate, these opinions we have about looking after Maori, about them being sovereign and not wanting to wipe out Maori, he says we hold these opinions with unimpaired force. In other words, nobody's forcing us to do this, to think this in this way. But he says something beyond our control has compelled us to alter our course. What course? They were thinking that they wouldn't interfere with New Zealand at all. They were going to not have it as a colony at all. But something happened that compelled them to change their course. And he says, I do not scruple to avow that we depart from it with extreme reluctance. What does he mean by all this? Who's he talking about?
Wakefield.
Yes, he's talking about Wakefield. Because
Getting here before them.
Yes, Wakefield pretty much gave England, the British, the one finger in early 1839 and said, I'm going to New Zealand to set up an alternative government. And what date did he leave England?
12th of May.
The 12th of May.
1839.
Yeah, 12th of May. And what ship? What was the name of the ship he went on?
Tory.
Yeah, T-O-R-Y, HMS Tory.
Tory.
And how many tons was it?
400.
400. And what did he have on board?
Juice up.
Yes, hearts.
He had
Pipes.
juice harps, pipes, and pots. So he had metal pots, and he was going to use all that to barter to get land from Maori. And this really freaked out the British, because if it was a sovereign government here and Maori were a sovereign nation, then they were open to do whatever they wanted with their country because it was theirs. And so Wakefield had every right to come here and start buying land. It wasn't a British colony then. And he thought he'd get the jump on the British, so he did. And when he left and the British found out about it, they pushed the panic button. And they said, man, we got to get over there really quick. So what's the first thing they did on June the 15th?
They made New Zealand part of New South Wales, or what was Australia.
Exactly. Yeah. They made, on paper, they said, right, formally, we're going to make New Zealand part of New South Wales. Now, they couldn't do that actually. They did it on paper because New Zealand did not have sovereignty. Sorry, Britain did not have sovereignty over New Zealand at that stage. You can't say we're going to make New Zealand part of New South Wales when they didn't get sovereignty from the Maoris.
Mm-hmm.
But it was on paper anyway, and then the next thing that happened. So we go May, June, July. What happened on July the 30th?
3rd of July.
Hobson.
Yes, Hobson. What, Lester?
Arrived.
Mm-hmm.
No.
He was installed.
He became.
No, he wasn't installed.
He was appointed Lieutenant General.
He was appointed. So they quickly said, who's going to do this job? Quickly, we've got to get somebody to go to New Zealand. Hurry, hurry, hurry. Rush, rush, rush. Who's going to be the man? And they said, Hobson. He's the man. He's been there in 1837 because he went on the Rattlesnake and did a bit of a tour to give us a report on New Zealand. And he's a good man. And so they chose him. Well, what's the next thing that happened? So we got May, June, July, August. 20th of August, what happened?
Wakefield. Arrived.
No.
Hobson left Plymouth with his family.
Hobson left Plymouth, but I think what he did, he left Plymouth, but on the 16th of August, what happened?
Wakefield arrived.
Yes, he arrived just before Hobson was leaving. So he got a big jump on him. So when he says we retain these opinions in unimpaired force and through circumstances entirely beyond our control, have at length compelled us to alter our course. He says, mate, some stuff happened at home that's really given us a kick up the butt, and we've got to get on with New Zealand. And he's talking about Wakefield. I do not scruple to avow that we depart from it with extreme reluctance. He says, you know what, we didn't want to do this, but we're going to have to, because of pretty much because of Wakefield.
Can I ask you something there?
Yes.
We retain these opinions in unimpaired force. Did they have the thought that perhaps we should just go in there and blow it over?
No. He's talking about unimpaired force. He's meaning that we retain these opinions in unimpaired force. In other words, nobody is...
Nothing stopping them?
Yeah,
No one's forcing.
Nothing's stopping them from holding these opinions. Nobody's forcing them to have these opinions about Maori and about them being sovereign. Nobody's forcing them. He says, mate, you know what? We formed these by ourselves with nobody coercing us or forcing us to hold these opinions. And then he goes on to, we're going to have to change our tack. The necessity, by the way, they did consider coming in here by force. But you know what? Somebody's got their microphone on, which is it's making it hard. Somebody's got their mic on, whoever that was.
Few of us have.
Okay, so there was a consideration of coming in here and just using force to push Maori aside, but there was two thoughts that made that quickly took that off the table. What were they? The missionaries. They said, you can't do that because we've been working with them for 26 years. And the second thing was that, you know what, they actually were a bit fearful of Maori. And they thought if there was 80,000 or between 75 and 80,000 Maori here, they're all hardened warriors, used to fighting all the time. And that made them sort of sit up and think a little bit about, you know what, there's only going to be a few of us here. If they turned on us, they just overwhelm us. And then they thought about, okay, so if we did take the place by force, what are we going to need? We're going to need 10 warships and 10,000 men with guns. And you know what put them off that thought? Money. They said it's expensive. War is expensive. It costs a lot of money to put on a war. Guns, bullets, uniforms, salaries, food for the troops. And so all things considered, but the main influence on stopping them doing this was actually the missionaries. The missionaries said, you can't do this. There's no possibility of you doing this. And, you know, like I told you, that Christian revival had been sweeping through Britain in the 1830s. And Britain started to think about what they call humanitarian colonization, which is really trying to go into countries and really looking after the Aboriginal people of the country. So let's read on. The reports which have reached this office within the last few months established the fact about the commencement of 1838, a body of not less than 2,000 British subjects has become permanent residents of New Zealand, and among them were many persons of bad and doubtful character. Well, who are these people? Convicts who had fled from their penal settlements, and seamen who had deserted their ships. Well, what are they up to? He says this, and that these people, unrestrained by any law and amenable to no tribunals, in other words, they're lawless, were alternately the authors and victims of every species of crime and outrage. So what's he saying there?
It's a lawless country.
It's an absolutely lawless hellhole.
And they instigated it, most of it.
Yeah, and it was all British people. And he said, the reports which have reached this office, so where were they getting their intel from?
Missionaries.
Yeah, the missionaries are giving them good intelligence. Who else?
Well, Busby was there too, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. Well done. Good point. And when did he arrive in New Zealand?
Busby.
1833.
Yes, 1833.
So he'd been there for 7 years, and he was communicating with the British government all the way through that period. Who else? So they had the missionaries giving them intel. They had Busby giving them intel. Who else? Well, the Maoris. Some of the Maoris had been to London.
Mm.
So he says, and also Hobson had been to New Zealand in what year?
37.
That's right. On what was the name of his ship?
The rattlesnake.
The Rattlesnake. And he'd gone back to England with a report for the British. And so they had these various sources of intelligence.
Also, the Maori, the chiefs would have written the letter to the king by then too, would they?
Yeah, well, 1831 there was a letter written to the king, but also 1835 there was communication. I mean, Busby was communicating with the British all the time, with the Home Office, if you want to call it that.
Mm-hmm.
Established the facts that at the commencement of 1838, a body of not less than 2,000 British subjects, so there was 2,000, that's in 1838, it's 2 years before the treaty, there was 2,000 people in New Zealand who were British subjects.
Mm.
And they become permanent inhabitants of New Zealand. So they were in here for the long haul. But he says, among them, they're not all like that, not all bad, but among them, the 2,000, were many persons of bad and doubtful character. So he actually says there's many of them, but not all of them. And we know that they are seamen and people who'd escaped from penal settlements. Now, where was the nearest penal settlement?
Tasmania.
So what had happened is these convicts had got out of the prison in Tasmania. They'd made their way to the shore, to Sydney. They got a job on a boat, a ship. And then when they got here, they abandoned ship and just came ashore. They would have just jumped over the side, or when a ship landed here, they just scarpered. They just buggered off into the country. Instead of not coming back, they got their passage over here. Now, when they arrived, they would have had nothing except the clothes they were wearing. Very little employment. But you're gonna get hungry pretty soon. You're gonna get cold. So what are you going to do to survive?
Steal.
That's it. And so, hence, I put myself in situations, try to put myself into that situation. What would I do? You'd have no option but to steal. You had no chance. You had no money. You had no way of growing anything. You didn't have fishing lines and hooks and fire and pots and pans and everything to, sort of live like a hobo on the beach. You had none of that. So the only way to get that, you had no money, was to steal. And hence, that these people, it says, unrestrained by any law and amenable to no tribunal, were alternately the authors and victims of every species of crime and outrage. In other words, they were alternately the authors of crime and outrage. That means they are the ones who are perpetrating it, committing the crimes, but they were also the victims. So everybody was a victim, and everybody was an author of crime. It was crime central. Then he goes on to say, it further appears that extensive cessions of land have been obtained from the natives. Wow. This is interesting. This is according to his intel. Now, Maori say they lost all their land, but that's just BS. Because the British, with their intelligence, said, well, we know that extensive cessions of land. Now, cession is sale. That's the British word for sale. Extensive sales of land have been obtained from the natives, from the Maori. So just swap out the word cessions for sale. Extensive sales of land have been obtained from the natives. This is not a little bit of land, this is extensive. Like millions of acres. How many acres is New Zealand in total? Does anybody know? I know, but I'm asking you.
66 million.
Yeah, 66 million. And conservative estimates put it that a third of New Zealand had been sold before 1840.
So most of that would have been Wakefield and the New Zealand company, wouldn't it?
No, because he wasn't there at the he set off as we said, on the 12th of May 1839. So this is sort of not including Wakefield. There was 2,000 people here, and when they arrived, these people, well, what would you do? You'd go. They'd come all the way from England, a body of not less than 2,000 British subjects. You'd come here. And let's be just realistic. What would they do? That the ship would come into port. They'd get off the ship. They'd have some money in their pocket, their children, husband or wife, and a few kids. And the first thing they do is, right, we've got to make a home here. Well, you can't build a home without land, so we've got to go and get some land. Who do we buy that from? Maori. And the homes they built, honestly, there's early homes. I mean, I could show you early New Zealand houses. Let's have a look.
Panga huts.
Yeah, they were sort of, if we went pre-1840 here, you could see what they were building. Let's go to images.
Pretty basic.
Well, these are some early, this is the really early, but you can't see much there.
That one.
There's one. A settler's foray. It's basically just a settler's house. That would have been pretty rude inside there.
What was that made of then?
We could go in and have a look. Let's have a look and see what that was made of. That's a better picture of it. Many of the first European who settled in New Zealand lived in Maori-style foray. They should say house because they're using Maori words. I just object to that so much. Whose design was sometimes modified to reflect European housing traditions. So that would have been probably on the roof.
It says flax and raupo reeds.
Yeah, the foray or huts were built on the Petone foreshore by Maori to house some of the first Pākehā settlers. While made from traditional materials such as flax and raupo reeds, their design resembled a small English cottage with steeply pitched roofs. So they made them out of raupo reeds. You know those reeds that you get in sort of those reedy areas?
Mm-hmm.
And flax.
They might have used flax a bit like, to make a thatched roof.
Yeah, because flax is actually waterproof.
Mm.
So if you put a whole lot of flax on a roof and you do it properly, you're not going to get any leaks. And then they had raupo reeds on the roof, and I guess the sides would have been the same.
Well, they must have used some sort of timber for a frame, though.
Mm.
Oh yeah, no. They would have used timber for a frame, no doubt about that. So
they look very much like an old Devon cottage.
Mm.
Yeah, so let's see if there's any other houses here. I doubt it.
And no windows.
Not really. Well.
Okay, so here's an early picture. Look, this is 1841. The early European settlers often lived under canvas. while awaiting the erection of the forest-style or European housing. This painting of Nelson shows the tents erected for the New Zealand Company officials. That's Wakefield, because he ran the New Zealand Company. And mechanics who arrived in 1841 to survey and build accommodation for early settlers. So, you know what? The New Zealand Company with Wakefield, they were just absolutely going for it. They arrived with ships and surveyors, and they were going, bugger you, we're just going to get into this. Eventually, look, prefabricated immigrant barracks are visible on the left. They started bringing, see that one there? They started bringing prefabricated houses to New Zealand. In other words, you know, what do you call them? They're just houses that are pre-made, and you like a Lego. You just put them together when you arrive in New Zealand, because they thought, mate, if we're going to get timber, you've got to have timber mills. You've got to have, you know, everything. So let's get all the timber from where we've got everything set up in Britain, and we will just get kit set houses going.
Right on the waterfront, prime real estate.
Yeah. Anchored in the harbour are the Will Watch, Whitby and Arrow. That's 3 ships on which the group had travelled from Britain. So Wakefield was now bringing 3 ships in at a time. But people arrived, the point I was making was that people arrived with money in their pocket, and they were going, mate, we've got to live somewhere. I've got the kids here. There's no hotels. There's no motels. And so many of them probably bought a tent and stuck it up while they you know, to get going. And they might have had some food, pretty much like camping, until they bought land off Maori. And the point I'm making is they had to go and buy land off Maori and then build a house on that land. Wow, look at that. V-huts were distinctive to the Canterbury settlement and were put up as temporary accommodation for new settlers. The buildings consisted of a thatched roof with door and windows at one end. They appear not to have had chimneys, suggesting cooking was done outside. These were built in Riccarton and photographed in 1864.
Wow.
Steep pitch roof too.
Very steep.
Probably for the snow.
Yeah, very steep pitch roof, and no, basically, yeah, pretty much just like a glorified tent, really. So this is what we're dealing with now. If we go back to our brief, Lord Normanby's brief, these 2,000 people, we were talking about land. He says it further appears that extensive cessions of land have been obtained from the natives. So these 2,000 people are all rocking in, buying land off natives. And that several hundred persons have recently sailed from this country, that's Britain, to occupy and cultivate these lands. So these are serious people coming here to set up for life. They may have bought plows and horses and, you know, axes.
That just says to me that it was pre-bought and that these people have left after that it was purchased for them. That's how I'm reading it, but
New Zealand Company.
Yeah. It seems to be that. Oh, that's just how I'm reading it.
Well, there's no doubt about it that pre 1840, the New Zealand Company was red hot wanting to do that. They were wanting to come here. That's why he set off on the 12th of May, 1839, with all his Jews, harps and pots and pipes on board, because he had a plan to buy up great big areas of New Zealand and then subdivide it all and have. He had people back in London, a big group of people back in London, who were ready to sell the idea to British people, and say, look, I've got a section of land for you to live on, and it's all been surveyed and everything, pretty much like a map of a subdivision. He was presenting those to people in Britain, saying, choose which piece of land you want, and he was an entrepreneur.
Mm.
and he was selling it like, the flight centre. He was selling land back in England to people. He'd come here with surveys and everything, blah blah blah, and he wanted to quickly buy land and then subdivide it and then sell all the plots to people in London to bring them out here. And that's what he actually did.
Well, he was here for a few months doing it, wasn't he? So he probably did manage to get quite a bit.
Yeah, he was a big worry to the British because, mate, he was a threat. The spirit of adventure thus being effectually roused, he says, mate, these people they're all stirred up with adventure going to New Zealand,
It would have been a big attraction as well, because you were either wealthy or quite poor. You didn't have a middle class in those days.
Yeah, and I've seen some of the advertising that he used. I mean, honestly, it was pretty over the top. He was saying, the fish are jumping out of the water into your pan, you can grow gooseberries the size of tennis balls, and all kinds of fruit and vegetables, and the climate here is amazing. Everything just grows like wildfire, and he really talked it up.
Well, it was compared to the UK.
Yeah, no, it was definitely but he really painted it up, better than it really was. But that's what he was doing. The spirit of adventure thus being effectually roused, it can no longer be doubted that an extensive settlement of British subjects will be rapidly established in New Zealand. So what's he saying there?
The British are coming.
Yeah.
Yeah, he says, mate, we can't stop this. This is out of control.
Mm. Hey, when was it first noticed? When was New Zealand actually called New Zealand first? Was that the Dutch, New Zealandia?
It was the Dutch, and it was 1765, I think.
Okay.
No, 42. 1642, I think, I'm pretty certain. And then Cook came here 1769. But it was the Dutch who named it Zealandia or something like that.
Yep.
And
so it's always been called New Zealand, eh?
Yes, it has. So this whole
New Zealand.
This Aotearoa crap, that's all got to do with just brainwashing because they're getting us ready for tribal rule.
Yep. It was called New Terreni at some point too, wasn't it? Yeah. That was I forget when that came about.
That unless protected and restrained by necessary laws and institutions, they will repeat unchecked in that corner of the globe the same process of war and spoliation, that is, wrecking the place, under which uncivilized tribes have almost invariably disappeared, as often as they have been brought into the immediate vicinity of immigrants from the nations of Christendom. Well, that's a good sentence. So what he's saying is, well, you tell me what he's saying there.
Colonisation hasn't been so kind to the natives in earlier.
Yes, colonisation's been a bit of a disaster for the native people, because what happens is they'll end up going to war with the native people, the Maori people. We end up going to war with the settlers, and these settlers, look, the process of war and spoliation. Now, if you look up that word spoliation, so he says there's two things that are going to wreck the Maori: war and spoliation. So let's look that word up. And it means the action of ruining or destroying something. Somebody's got their microphone on and they're squeaking around on their chair.
That could be me. Yeah.
Okay, so he's saying the process of war and spoliation under which uncivilized tribes, that's Maori, have almost invariably disappeared. So he says, mate, you know what? These people who are unrestrained, unless protected and restrained by necessary laws and institutions, these runaway convicts and seamen who've abandoned their ships. He says, unless these people are restrained by necessary laws and institutions, they're going to wreck Maori. They're going to start wars with Maori and wreck them. And the result of this is that Maori are going to be invariably disappear. And so he says to mitigate, in other words, to stop this happening, and if possible, avert these disasters. See, all of this is about looking after Maori. Mate, the whole thing is just about all of it's to do with, we really want to treat Maori with like kids' gloves and care for them, look after them. He says to mitigate and if possible avert these disasters and to rescue the immigrants themselves from the evils of lawless state of society. So he's saying, you know what? This is not just about Maori, but it's also protecting the British people who are here from each other. And he says, it has been resolved to adopt the most effective measure for establishing among them a settled form of civil government. Whoa. He says, it has been resolved. Who said this? Well, it's the British Parliament. They said, if you go to New Zealand, the first thing you got to do is you got to set up a government. Because a government has judges, courts, policemen, laws, courts, lawyers, justice system, jails, punishment, so on. It has been resolved to adopt the most effective measures for establishing among them a settled form of civil government. Then the big clanger, look, this big sentence. To accomplish this design is the principal object of your mission. Now he says, mate, you know what? You got to set up a government here, Hobson. Now by government, you think of everything we have in New Zealand that constitutes a government. You name some of the things that we have in New Zealand that constitute a government. Go on.
Well, you've got law and order, so you've got a judicial system.
You've got to have a judicial system. You've got to have, what else?
Parliament.
You've got to have parliament. You're going to start having elections. Yep. What else? You've got to have education. You've got to have hospitals. You've got to have schools. You've got to have roads. You've got to have bridges. You've got to have housing. You've got to have
taxes.
You've got to have taxes. Yeah, well done. You've got to have taxes because this thing's got to fund itself.
Mm.
So he's saying here, it has been resolved. He's saying in Britain, by the Parliament in Britain, to adopt the most effective measures for establishing among them, that's Maori, and the settlers who are here, a settled form of civil government. Now, you know what? This idea that Maori have today, Maori activists like Margaret Mutu and a whole lot of them, Debbie Nariopaka, saying that, oh, you know what? We only gave the British permission to rule over the settlers. This is absolute crap. Because it's very clear from here that they were going to rule over Maori. And they were setting up a government to help Maori. Because look, this was never going to be just the government. The British were never going to come here and just have two countries within this country, a Maori country and a European country and a British country. The activists today say, oh, you know, we Maori only gave the British permission to rule over settlers and not rule over us. Well, this is just nonsense. Because he says to mitigate. What does that mean? Mitigate means to prevent Maori from disappearing and being blown off the planet by wars and spoliation. And if possible, avert these disasters. So he's thinking about Maori. And to rescue the immigrants, that's the British, themselves from the evil of a lawless society. So we're talking here about both Maori and settlers, not one or the other, both. It has been resolved to adopt the most effective means for establishing among them a civil form of government. To accomplish this design is the principal object of your mission. Wow, look at that. Isn't that fantastic? Now that'll do for tonight because we're 7:54. But can you just summarize what you've learnt tonight on this session? If somebody said to you, what was Hobson's brief about?
Protecting the Maori.
Yes, that's one big, huge one. Well done, Lester. What else?
Handle the British people that are coming to live here.
Yep, the British handle the British people. They've got to be brought under the law.
Mm-hmm.
What else?
Set up a civil government.
Yep, to set up the British were keen to say and make a priority of setting up a government. What else?
Mm-hmm. They didn't plan to do that, but because Wakefield was here trying to buy up land, they felt they needed to take action.
Yeah, they weren't going to colonize New Zealand, but Wakefield forced their hand.
But they also saw the value that was in New Zealand too. The location.
Yes, and
the wealth that was there.
Yes, and rich in resources, and also the location, geography. Yep, well done, Mark. What else do we learn tonight? There were two kinds of bad people here. Who were they?
Seamen who abandoned their ships.
Seamen who'd abandoned their ships, and convicts who'd escaped. And how many people were here in 1838?
2,000.
2,000. Yeah.
2,000 British. Yeah.
2,000 British, and they were pretty lawless. How many Maori were here?
75,000.
Yep. And what was the total? How many acres in New Zealand?
66.
That's worth remembering, because often you hear Tuku Morgan and other activists saying, you know what, they stole 1 million acres from us, but 1 million acres is only a tiny proportion of New Zealand. It's only a small thing. It sounds like a lot because they try and make it sound like a lot, but when you think about it in terms of what it is in relation to 66 million, it's hardly anything. It's a drop in the bucket.
Yeah.
Okay, you guys, thank you for a good night. And
thank you.
Thank you.
Well, did you learn
you.
a lot from this?
Yeah.
It's good.
Yes. I like it how you go over things again and again, because that's how I learn. It's just keep putting it in.
Yeah, and you feed extra bits of information in each time, so it just builds a big picture, doesn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I like the fact that they wanted to respect the Maori, and help them. And I think it's because Busby had already been here. The first time he came here, if it had been a horrendous experience for him, he might have been in two doubts about coming back as a governor.
Yes, that's true. That's true. He must have had some pretty good impressions that this place was he could make a go of this. I want you to remember this though as well. Look, it further appears that extensive cessions of land have already been obtained from the natives. That's an important thing to remember.
And several hundred people are there and come to occupy the land, cultivate it.
Yeah, and they all bought land off Maori. So, you know what? The other thing that activists say today was we would never sell our land because it's sacred to us. Well, this is just BS.
I read a book a little while ago called Young Nick's Head, and it was about Captain Cook and about the young guy who stowed away on his ship. And when Cook was in around New Zealand, it was kind of almost a potluck dinner as to what you were going to get when you pulled up in the harbour.
Yeah,
you're going to get someone's going to try and come and steal it. Well, quite often they came on and stole stuff.
Yeah,
or people they traded, or they were just straight away unfriendly. So there was you didn't know what you were going to get from harbour to harbour. That's how quite diverse it was. So maybe Hobson was lucky when he came here the first time.
Yeah, good point, Mark, although he was very familiar with the fact that they were cannibals. I mean, the first missionary here, what was his name?
Samuel Marsden. He writes that when he spent his first night here in a pa, he said it was the strangest feeling being in the middle of cannibals.
and he slept with one eye open.
Yeah.
Well, you would, wouldn't you?
Because he was thinking that he could be dinner.
Count his limbs in the morning.
Yeah.
Uha and the Pakeha.
That's right. So
Yeah.
anyway, interesting times here for us.
Are we going back to that?
Well,
We could be going back to that, yep.